You should have the illustration of a prepaid expense account open as you listen and watch this short video. On any farm or ranch, it's quite usual at the end of the fiscal year that the business has some supplies on hand. In other words, supplies it has bought during the year but just simply did not use them all. However, if you bought those, say in 2014, at the end of the year you hadn't used them, and then you used them in 2015, the cash system would record them in 2014, but an accrual system would actually record them in 2015. And since our focus in this class is on an accrual system, then we must have some way to put a value on those prepaid expenses at the end of the fiscal year. This little illustration is just a simple three items that we'll put a value on and show how it would create a prepaid expense account. And then later, when we get to the financial statements, you'll see how this is used to make the accrual adjustments. But for now, it's just how to create the prepaid expense account. So in this illustration, we're going to assume that we had three things on hand at the end of the fiscal year. We had some diesel, we had some chemicals, we had some feed. I think you will see immediately that there could be quite a long list there, and even things like chemicals could be broken into different categories because they might have different values and you might have different quantities. But to keep it simple, we've got three items. The units simply say what is the unit for that particular item. So we got gallons for diesel and chemicals, and we got hundredweight for feed. The quantity is simply how much you have. In other words, out to the shed and count them and see how much is there of each of those items. The value per unit, though, this column here is sometimes confusing. It shouldn't be what you can sell them for, because that's not what you have those items for. You have them to use on the farm. So the conventional way, the way the literature suggests, you should value those at what you paid for them, not what you could sell them for, because you're not in the business of selling those items. Of course, the total column is simply price or value per unit times quantity. Okay? And that'll give you the total. Now, what you should do in this account, and of course there's many different ways you could set it up, but in this illustration what you would do is you would find totals here for all those items for 2014, and then here in this cell you would total all items. So in other words, you'd get a total for diesel, chemicals, and feed, and then you'd add them up. And that would give you your prepaid expenses for 2014. Now at the end of the fiscal year in 2015, you would do exactly the same thing. And these categories would not have to be exactly the same. You could have something else that would be a typical operating expense that you had on hand. But for our illustration, I kept them the same. Again, we have the units, the quantity, and this again is the price that you paid for those items. So for 2015, you would get totals. You would add those totals up and then get another total for 2015. Okay. Now, here's where things are a little different. Pay very close attention. It's not going to completely explain why, but it will when we get to the financial statements. But when you get to the change here, you know what we have done in each of the others is we've taken the current year and subtracted the previous year. It's going to be the opposite for prepaid expenses, and I don't want to get into right now why, because that will be a part of the financial statements. But when you get the change, to calculate that change, that's going to be equal to the previous year total minus the current year total. In other words, it's just the opposite of how we've been doing that. And it'll make sense to you when we actually go and create the financial statements, because what it amounts to is that if that number goes up from one year to the next, that's actually should be used as to reduce expenses in the year, because what you're doing, you're buying things that's going to be used in the next year. But again, we will explain that in detail when we get to the financial statements. Now, for preparation for the weekly quiz, you should build a chart of accounts for this prepaid expense account, and you should do all the totals and calculate that change and have those numbers ready because they will be asked for on that weekly quiz.